The morning sun cast long shadows across the endless expanse of prairie grass, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. A lone figure sat hunched over a small campfire, the smoke rising straight up in the windless air like a prayer to the heavens above. Jake Morrison stirred the beans in his dented tin pot, listening to the distant whistle of the Union Pacific as it carved its way across the territory, carrying dreams and disappointments in equal measure. Jake had been riding the rails for 3 years now, working as a section hand, repairing track, and maintaining the great iron beast that connected east to west. His weathered hands bore the scars of countless days wrestling with railroad spikes and heavy rail, but his eyes still held the gentle kindness that had marked him since boyhood. At 32, he was old enough to have seen both the best and worst of what the frontier could offer, yet young enough to still believe in the possibility of something better waiting just over the next ridge. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through his morning reverie. Jake looked up from his breakfast to see a cloud of dust rising in the distance, moving fast toward his camp. He stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the grip of his Colt revolver, though he'd never drawn it in anger. As the dust cloud drew nearer, he could make out the silhouettes of 3 riders, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. The riders pulled up hard at the edge of his camp, their mounts snorting and prancing nervously. Jake recognized them immediately as railroad men like himself, though their faces were grim with urgency that set his nerves on edge. "Jake! Thank God we found you," called out Tom Bradley, the section foreman whose usually jovial demeanor had been replaced by something dark and troubled. "We got trouble up the line. Big trouble." Jake poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot hanging over his fire, offering the same to his unexpected visitors. "What kind of trouble, Tom? Track washout?" "Worse," replied the second rider, a young Irish immigrant named Seamus O'Malley whose bright red hair caught the morning light. "It's the Comanche. They got themselves a prisoner, and they're planning something terrible for her on the railroad tracks." The third man, an older gentleman with silver whiskers named Chester Hayes, removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow. "We saw the smoke signals yesterday evening, and this morning we rode out to investigate. Found their camp about 5 miles north of here, near where the tracks cross Willow Creek." Jake felt his stomach tighten with dread. "A prisoner? What kind of prisoner?" "A young woman," Chester said quietly. "Couldn't tell if she was white or Indian from the distance, but she's in a bad way. They got her tied up near the tracks, and from what we could see, they're planning to." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Tom picked up where Chester left off, his voice rough with anger and disgust. "They're planning to tie her to the rails when the eastbound comes through this afternoon. The 317 Express." Jake set down his coffee cup so hard that the hot liquid splashed over the rim and hissed against the metal. "How many of them?" "We counted maybe 8 or 10 Braves," Seamus said, his young voice tight with fear. "All painted for war, armed with rifles and bows. There's no way the 3 of us could take them on." "4 of us," Jake corrected quietly, already beginning to break down his camp. "I'm going with you." Chester shook his head vigorously. "Jake, you're a good man, but this isn't your fight. That girl is likely as good as dead already, and there's no sense in 4 good men dying alongside her." Jake paused in his packing and looked at the older man with eyes that held steel beneath their kindness. "Chester, I've been working these rails for 3 years now, and I've seen what this iron horse can do to a human body. I've scraped what was left of good people off these tracks more times than I care to remember. I'll be damned if I'm going to let that happen to some defenseless woman while I sit here drinking coffee." The determination in his voice was unmistakable, and the 3 riders exchanged glances. They had worked with Jake long enough to know that once he set his mind to something, there was no changing it. "All right then," Tom said with a heavy sigh. "But we do this smart. No heroics, no charging in with guns blazing. We scout the situation first, and if there's no way to save her without getting ourselves killed, we ride back to town and get the cavalry." Jake nodded his agreement, though privately he knew he could never ride away and leave someone to such a fate. He finished packing his gear and saddled his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle who had carried him faithfully across thousands of miles of frontier territory. As they prepared to ride toward what might be their deaths, Jake found himself thinking about his sister Mary back in Ohio, and how she had begged him not to come west. "Nothing but trouble and heartache waiting for you out there, Jake," she had said through her tears. "Stay here where it's safe, where you've got family." But Jake had felt the call of something beyond the familiar confines of his hometown, something that whispered promises of purpose and meaning in the vast spaces of the western frontier. Now, riding toward an almost certain confrontation with hostile Comanche warriors. He wondered if Mary hadn't been right after all. The four men rode hard across the rolling prairie, their horses' hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the sun-baked earth. The temperature was already climbing toward what promised to be a scorching afternoon, and heat waves shimmered in the distance like ghostly dancers. Jake felt the familiar weight of his gun belt around his waist and tried to remember the last time he had fired his pistol at anything other than rattlesnakes and empty bottles. As they crested a low hill overlooking Willow Creek, Tom raised his hand and the group reined in their mounts. Below them, the landscape opened up into a natural basin where the railroad tracks curved around a bend in the creek. The water ran shallow and clear over smooth stones, creating a peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with the grim purpose of their mission. "There," whispered Chester, pointing toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near the creek bank. "You can just make out their horses through the trees." Jake squinted against the bright morning sun and could indeed see the movement of ponies grazing in the shade. Thin wisps of smoke rose from what was obviously a camp hidden among the trees, and the occasional flash of color suggested the presence of the war party they had been tracking. "I don't see the woman," Seamus said nervously, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "Maybe they've already?" "No," interrupted Tom firmly. "Look at the tracks. See that wooden post driven into the ground between the rails? That's where they plan to do it." Jake studied the railway line and felt his heart sink. About 100 yards from the Comanche camp, someone had indeed driven a thick wooden stake into the ground directly between the railroad tracks. Even from their distant vantage point, he could see ropes attached to the post, and his imagination filled in the horrible details of what was planned. "The eastbound doesn't come through for another 4 hours," Chester observed, checking his pocket watch. "That gives us some time to plan, or it gives them 4 more hours to torture that poor soul." Jake replied grimly. "I say we get closer, see what we're really dealing with." They dismounted and led their horses down into a ravine that ran roughly parallel to the creek, using the natural depression in the land to mask their approach. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat soaked through their shirts as they made their way carefully through the tall grass and scattered rocks. When they were within 200 yards of the Comanche camp, Jake motioned for the others to wait while he crept forward alone. He had learned something about moving quietly during his years on the frontier, and his natural caution served him well as he worked his way from boulder to boulder, bush to bush, until he could finally see into the enemy camp. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The Comanche warriors were indeed painted for war, their faces and chests decorated with fierce designs in red and black paint. Their weapons were well maintained and ready for use, and Jake could see that these were experienced fighters, not young braves out for glory. But it was the sight of their prisoner that truly shook him to his core. She was young, perhaps no more than 20, with long dark hair that fell around her shoulders like a curtain. Her clothing was torn and dirty, suggesting she had been captive for some time, but even from his hiding place Jake could see that she held herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. Most surprising of all, as he studied her features more carefully, he realized she was not white as they had assumed, but Comanche herself. This revelation changed everything. Why would Comanche warriors be planning to execute one of their own people in such a brutal fashion? Jake watched the camp more carefully, trying to understand the dynamics of what he was witnessing. The girl sat with her back against a large rock, her hands bound behind her but her head held high. The warriors seemed to be ignoring her for the most part, going about their daily activities of cleaning weapons and preparing food. But Jake noticed that whenever one of them passed near her, she would flinch slightly, as if expecting a blow, or worse. One of the older warriors, his face marked with the scars of many battles, approached the girl and spoke to her in rapid Comanche. Though Jake couldn't understand the words, the tone was clearly threatening. The girl responded with what sounded like defiance, earning herself a backhanded slap that snapped her head to the side. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but he forced himself to remain hidden. Acting rashly now would only get them all killed and do nothing to help the girl. He needed to understand more about the situation before they could hope to devise a rescue plan. As he watched, the scarred warrior walked over to the wooden post they had driven between the railroad tracks and tested the ropes with obvious satisfaction. He called out something to his companions that made them all laugh in a way that chilled Jake's blood. Whatever they had planned for this girl, they were clearly looking forward to it. Jake began to work his way back toward his companions, moving even more carefully now that he understood the stakes involved. When he finally reached the ravine where Tom, Chester, and Seamus were waiting, all 3 men could see from his expression that the news was not good. "Well?" Tom asked quietly. There are 9 of them that I could see. All seasoned warriors, Jake reported in a whisper. But here's the strange part. The prisoner isn't white. She's Comanche, same as them. Chester frowned in confusion. That doesn't make sense. Why would they want to kill one of their own? I don't know, Jake admitted. But I can tell you she's not going willingly to whatever fate they have planned. This isn't some kind of ritual sacrifice. This is an execution. Seamus wiped nervous sweat from his forehead. Maybe she committed some crime against their tribe? Adultery or murder or something like that? Could be, Jake said, though something about the girl's bearing suggested to him that she was more victim than criminal. Either way, we can't let them tie her to those tracks. Tom checked his rifle and made sure his pistol was loaded. 9 warriors against 4 railroad men. Those aren't good odds, Jake. No, Jake agreed. They're not. But I keep thinking about something my father used to tell me when I was boy. He said that sometimes a man's worth isn't measured by the odds he faces, but by what he does when those odds are stacked against him. The 4 men looked at each other in the growing heat of the morning sun, each knowing that the next few hours would likely determine whether they lived to see another sunset. In the distance, they could hear the sound of the Comanche warriors talking and laughing around their camp, oblivious to the fact that their activities were being observed. All right then, Tom said finally. Let's figure out how we're going to do this thing. The sun climbed higher in the sky as the 4 railroad men huddled in the ravine, developing what they all knew was likely a desperate and foolhardy plan. The heat was becoming oppressive, and the lack of shade made their cramped hiding place feel like an oven. Chester kept checking his pocket watch nervously, counting down the hours until the eastbound express would come thundering around the bend. The way I see it, Tom said quietly, sketching rough diagrams in the sandy soil with a stick. We've got 2 basic problems. First, we need to get that girl away from the post where they plan to tie her. Second, we need to get all 5 of us out of here alive. Jake studied the crude map Tom had drawn, noting the positions of the Comanche camp, the railroad tracks, and the various natural features they might use for cover. What if we don't try to take them all on at once? What if we can create some kind of distraction that draws most of them away from the camp? What kind of distraction? Seamus asked skeptically. These aren't greenhorn cowboys we're dealing with. They're experienced warriors who know this country better than we do. Chester had been unusually quiet during their planning session, but now he spoke up with an idea that surprised them all. What about the railroad itself? What if we could somehow signal the eastbound to stop before it reaches the curve? Tom looked at the older man with new respect. Go on. Well, I've been working the rails for 20 years, and I know the engineers on most of these runs. Bill Patterson is driving the 317 Express today, and he's a good man. If we could get word to him somehow, maybe he could help us. Jake felt a spark of hope for the first time since they had started this grim mission. How far back would we need to stop the train to keep it from being seen or heard by the Comanche? Chester thought for a moment, calculating distances and timing in his head. At least 2 miles, maybe 3. But here's the thing. If we stop the train that far back, we'd need to get the girl away from the camp and to the train on foot. That's a lot of open ground to cover with 9 hostile warriors likely chasing us. Better than trying to shoot it out with them right here, Seamus pointed out. At least if we're running toward the train, we've got somewhere to go. Jake nodded slowly. The plan was far from perfect, but it was better than anything else they had come up with. All right, Chester, you're the fastest rider, and you know the engineer. You head back east along the tracks and find a way to signal the train to stop. Tom and Seamus, you create some kind of diversion on the north side of the camp, away from where they have the girl. I'll try to get to her during the confusion. Tom shook his head vigorously. Jake, that's suicide. You'll be going into their camp alone. Somebody has to, Jake replied simply. And I'm the best shot among us. If things go wrong, at least I might be able to give the rest of you time to get away. The 3 other men looked at him with expressions that mixed admiration and grave concern. They all knew he was right about the necessity of someone getting close to the prisoner, but they also knew he was essentially volunteering for what amounted to a suicide mission. When do we make our move? Chester asked, accepting the inevitable. Jake glanced at the sun, now high overhead and beating down with merciless intensity. Give me an hour to get into position. Chester, you head out now and stop that train as far back as you can manage. Tom and Seamus, wait exactly 1 hour, then start your diversion. Make it loud and obvious, but don't take any unnecessary risks. The goal is to draw them away from the girl, not to get yourselves killed in a gunfight." Chester stood up and brushed the sand from his clothes. Before leaving, he clasped Jake's hand in a firm grip. "You're a good man, Jake Morrison. If we don't make it out of this, I want you to know it's been an honor working alongside you." Jake felt a tightness in his throat as he watched the older man climb up out of the ravine and head toward his horse. Chester had a wife and grandchildren back in Denver, people who depended on him coming home safe. They all did, in one way or another. As Chester rode off toward the east, Jake began making his own preparations. He checked his weapons carefully, making sure his pistol was fully loaded and that he had extra cartridges in his belt. His rifle was a reliable Winchester that had served him well during his years on the frontier, and he knew he could count on it if the situation called for accurate shooting. Tom and Seamus were making their own preparations, gathering dried grass and small branches that they could use to start a diversionary fire. Their plan was simple but potentially effective: create enough smoke and commotion on the far side of the Comanche camp to draw the warriors away from their prisoner, giving Jake a chance to reach the girl and cut her bonds. "Jake," Tom said quietly as they finished their preparations, "there's something else we need to talk about. What if this girl doesn't want to be rescued? What if she really did commit some crime and this is tribal justice?" Jake had been wrestling with the same question, and he didn't have a good answer. "I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but I can't just stand by and watch someone get tied to railroad tracks, no matter what they might have done." Seamus checked his pocket watch, a nervous habit he had developed over the past hour. 30 minutes until we make our move. I sure hope Chester finds that train in time." Jake was thinking the same thing, along with a dozen other concerns that could derail their hastily constructed plan. What if the Comanche decided to move the girl before the appointed time? What if there were more warriors in the camp than he had counted? What if the diversion wasn't convincing enough to draw them away? But dwelling on such possibilities would only paralyze him with doubt. Instead, he focused on the immediate task at hand, getting close enough to the prisoner to attempt a rescue. He studied the terrain between his current position and the Comanche camp, noting every rock, bush, and depression that might provide cover during his approach. The girl's fate now rested in the hands of 4 railroad men who had never planned to be heroes. As Jake began his careful movement toward the enemy camp, he found himself offering up a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening, not for his own safety, but for the chance to do something right in a world that often seemed determined to reward only the cruel and the selfish. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of the Comanche warriors talking among themselves, their voices carrying on the hot, still air. Soon, one way or another, the talking would be over, and the shooting would begin. Jake moved like a ghost through the tall prairie grass, every sense heightened to an almost painful degree of awareness. The sun beat down mercilessly on his back as he crawled from one patch of cover to the next, his Winchester rifle cradled in his arms and his heart hammering against his ribs. Each blade of grass that rustled, each pebble that shifted under his weight, seemed loud enough to alert every Comanche warrior within miles of his presence. When he reached a position about 50 yards from the camp, Jake paused to catch his breath and survey the scene more carefully. The 9 warriors he had counted earlier were all visible, some tending to their weapons while others prepared what appeared to be some kind of ceremonial paint. The girl remained tied near the large rock, but now Jake could see that she was watching her captors with an intensity that suggested she was planning something herself. As he studied her more closely, Jake was struck by the intelligence and determination he saw in her dark eyes. This was not someone who had given up hope, despite her desperate circumstances. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with high cheekbones and skin bronzed by the prairie sun. Her clothing was simple but well-made, suggesting she came from a family of some standing within her tribe. Suddenly the girl's head turned in his direction, and for a heart-stopping moment Jake thought she had spotted him. But instead of crying out or trying to alert her captors, she simply stared at the spot where he was hiding. After what felt like an eternity, she gave an almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging his presence, then turned her attention back to the warriors. Jake was puzzled by her reaction. How had she known he was there? And why hadn't she alerted the Comanche? The questions would have to wait, however, as he heard Tom and Seamus beginning their diversion on the far side of the camp. The sound started as a low crackling, followed by the acrid smell of smoke drifting across the campsite. Within moments, shouts erupted from the Comanche warriors as they spotted what appeared to be a grass fire spreading rapidly toward their horse herd. Jake watched as 7 of the 9 men grabbed their weapons and raced toward the disturbance, leaving only 2 guards near the prisoner. This was his chance. but it would require perfect timing and more than a little luck. Jake waited until the bulk of the war party was fully engaged with the fire, then began his final approach to the camp. The remaining 2 guards were facing away from him, watching their companions fight the flames, giving Jake the opening he needed. He covered the last 20 yards in a crouching run, his boots silent on the sandy ground. The first guard never knew what hit him as Jake struck him with the butt of his rifle, dropping the man unconscious to the ground. The second warrior began to turn at the sound of his companion falling, but Jake was already on him, wrapping his arm around the man's throat and cutting off his air supply. "Don't struggle, and you won't be hurt," Jake whispered in the man's ear as he tightened his grip. Within seconds, the warrior went limp in his arms, unconscious but alive. Jake quickly turned his attention to the girl, who was watching him with wide eyes that held hope mixed with disbelief. He pulled out his knife and began cutting her bonds, speaking to her in the soothing tones he might use with a frightened horse. "Easy now, miss. I'm here to help you. My name is Jake Morrison, and I work for the railroad. We're going to get you out of here." To his surprise, she responded in heavily accented but clear English. You came for me? But why? You do not know me." Jake finished cutting the ropes around her wrists and helped her to her feet. "That doesn't matter right now. Can you run?" She nodded, rubbing the circulation back into her hands. "Yes, I can run, but you do not understand. They will follow us. They will never stop hunting us. We'll worry about that later," Jake replied, checking to make sure the diversionary fire was still keeping most of the warriors busy. "Right now we need to get to the railroad tracks. There's a train coming that will take us to safety." The girl looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "A train? The Iron Horse? That's right. Now come on. We need to move before they realize what's happened." But even as Jake spoke, he could hear shouts of alarm coming from the direction of the fire. Someone had apparently discovered that the fire was not natural and had begun to suspect a trap. The diversion that was supposed to give them precious time to escape was already beginning to unravel. Jake grabbed the girl's hand and began leading her away from the camp toward the railroad tracks. They had covered perhaps 100 yards when the first shots rang out behind them, followed by the sound of running feet and angry voices. The Comanche warriors had discovered their missing prisoner and were giving chase. "This way," Jake shouted, pulling the girl toward a shallow depression in the ground that would provide some cover from the pursuing bullets. They threw themselves down just as a volley of rifle shots whistled overhead, the bullets kicking up spurts of dirt around them. "Can you shoot?" Jake asked the girl as he returned fire with his Winchester, trying to slow down their pursuers. "Yes," she replied, surprising him again. "Give me a gun and I will show you." Jake handed her his pistol, keeping the rifle for himself. "Just remember, we're trying to get away, not fight a war. Only shoot if you have to." The girl took the Colt with practiced ease and checked to make sure it was loaded. "What is your plan?" Jake Morrison of the railroad. "My friends stopped the eastbound train about 2 miles east of here," Jake replied, pausing to fire at a warrior who was trying to flank their position. "If we can reach it, we'll be safe." 2 miles? The girl shook her head grimly. "They will catch us long before we reach this Iron Horse of yours. There are too many of them, and they know this land too well." Jake was beginning to fear she was right. Already he could see the Comanche warriors spreading out to surround their meager position, moving with the skill and coordination of experienced hunters. Tom and Seamus were somewhere out there, hopefully making their own way toward the train, but Jake couldn't count on any help from them. "What's your name?" he asked the girl as they prepared for what might be their last stand. "I am called Aiyana," she replied, her voice steady despite their desperate circumstances. "It means eternal blossom in my language. My father gave me that name because he said I was like a flower that would bloom forever." Jake felt a surge of protectiveness toward this brave young woman who faced death with such dignity. "Well, Aiyana, I promise you this. If we don't make it out of here, it won't be because we didn't try." She looked at him with eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul. "You are a good man, Jake Morrison. But there is something you must know about me, something that will change how you feel about helping me." Before Jake could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air. The Comanche warriors were closing in for the final assault, and whatever secrets Aiyana might have would have to wait. Jake raised his rifle and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The thundering of hooves grew louder as the Comanche warriors closed in on their position. Jake counted at least 6 mounted braves circling their shallow depression like wolves around trapped prey, while the others approached on foot with rifles ready. The situation looked hopeless, But Jake had not come this far to give up without a fight. "Aiyana," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off their attackers. "Whatever you need to tell me can wait. Right now I need you to stay low and watch our backs. Can you do that?" She nodded, gripping his pistol with both hands in a stance that showed she had indeed handled firearms before. "Jake Morrison, there is something you must understand about these men. They are not just any Comanche warriors. They are my brothers." Jake's blood went cold. "Your brothers?" "Not by blood," she said quickly, seeing his expression. "But they are from my band, my people. And I have brought great shame upon them." Before Jake could process this revelation fully, the attack began. The mounted warriors charged from 3 directions at once, their war cries splitting the hot afternoon air as they bore down on the 2 defenders. Jake's Winchester barked repeatedly, and he had the satisfaction of seeing one of the attackers tumble from his horse. Beside him, Aiyana's pistol cracked twice in rapid succession, and another warrior's mount went down in a tangle of legs and dust, but there were too many of them. Even as Jake and Aiyana fought desperately, more Comanche warriors closed in from all sides. Jake knew they had perhaps minutes before they would be overwhelmed, and the thought filled him not with fear for himself, but with rage at his failure to save this brave young woman. Then, cutting through the sound of gunfire and war cries, came the long, mournful whistle of a locomotive. Jake's heart leaped as he realized that Chester had succeeded in stopping the eastbound train, and it was now approaching their position. The iron horse's whistle blew again, longer and more insistent, as if the engineer was trying to signal their location. The effect on the Comanche warriors was immediate and dramatic. Several of them pulled up short, staring in the direction of the approaching train with expressions that mixed awe and fear. Jake realized that some of them had probably never seen a locomotive up close, and the sight of the great black engine with smoke pouring from its stack was enough to give even seasoned warriors pause. "The iron horse comes," Aiyana whispered, her voice filled with something that might have been wonder or dread. Jake seized the momentary confusion among their attackers to grab Aiyana's hand and pull her from their defensive position. "Come on. This is our chance." They broke from cover and ran toward the sound of the approaching train, zigzagging across the open prairie as bullets whistled around them. Behind them, the Comanche warriors recovered from their initial shock and gave chase, but the sight of the locomotive had clearly shaken some of them. As they crested a low rise, Jake could see the train in the distance, black smoke billowing from its stack as it approached at reduced speed. Chester had managed to stop it perhaps 1.5 miles from their position, close enough to offer hope of rescue but far enough to avoid being caught in the crossfire. "Can you make it?" Jake shouted to Aiyana as they ran. "I will make it or die trying," she replied, her breath coming in gasps but her pace never faltering. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the train when Jake heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the thunder of many hooves approaching fast from behind. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw that more Comanche warriors had joined the chase. It looked like the entire war party was now pursuing them. At least 15 mounted braves spread out across the prairie in a line that would be impossible to evade. "Jake!" Aiyana cried out, pointing ahead of them. "Look!" Following her gaze, Jake saw 2 familiar figures running toward them from the direction of the train. Tom and Seamus had made their way to safety and were now coming back to help, their rifles ready for action. The sight of his friends filled Jake with renewed strength, and he found reserves of speed he didn't know he possessed. The next few minutes became a blur of desperate running, gunfire, and the growing roar of the locomotive as it continued its approach. Tom and Seamus opened fire on the pursuing Comanche, forcing them to spread out and take cover, which slowed their pursuit just enough to give the fleeing pair a chance. As they neared the train, Jake could see Chester leaning out of the locomotive's cab, waving frantically for them to hurry. The engineer, a grizzled veteran named Bill Patterson, had the engine running at just above an idle, ready to pour on steam the moment his unexpected passengers were aboard. "Jump!" Chester yelled as they reached the slowly moving train. Tom and Seamus had already swung aboard one of the freight cars and were now providing covering fire from their mobile platform. Jake boosted Aiyana up onto the train first, then grabbed for a handhold himself. For a terrifying moment he thought he would miss, but Aiyana's strong hand gripped his wrist and helped pull him aboard just as the locomotive began to pick up speed. The Comanche warriors, seeing their quarry escaping, made one final desperate charge. Several of them rode alongside the accelerating train, trying to leap aboard or at least get close enough for accurate shots. Jake and his companions returned fire, the sound of gunshots mixing with the rhythmic chuffing of the locomotive, and the screech of steel wheels on steel rails. Gradually, the superior speed of the iron horse began to tell. One by one, the Comanche ponies fell behind, unable to match the pace of the mechanical beast. The warriors pulled up their mounts and sat watching as the train disappeared into the distance, their prisoner lost to them forever. As the immediate danger receded, Jake found himself able to breathe normally for the first time in hours. He looked around at his companions, Tom nursing a bullet graze on his arm, Seamus white-faced but uninjured, Chester grinning with relief from the locomotive cab, and Aiyana sitting quietly in the corner of the freight car, her dark eyes unreadable. "Well," Tom said, wincing as he tied a bandana around his wounded arm, "that was about as close as I ever want to come to meeting my maker." Seamus was examining his rifle to make sure it hadn't been damaged during their escape. "I still can't believe we made it out of there alive. Those were some mighty fine warriors chasing us." Jake nodded, then turned to Aiyana. "Now then, miss, I think it's time you told us exactly what this was all about. Why were your own people planning to tie you to the railroad tracks?" Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the prairie rolling past the open door of the freight car. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the sound of the train. "Because I chose love over loyalty," she said simply, "and in doing so I betrayed everything my people hold sacred." The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels on the tracks provided a steady backdrop as Aiyana began her story. The afternoon sun slanted through the open door of the freight car, casting long shadows across the wooden floor where the 5 refugees sat recovering from their harrowing escape. Jake found himself studying the young Comanche woman's face as she spoke, noting the pain that flickered in her dark eyes. "My father is Warcloud, a chief of the Yamparika band," she began, her English careful but clear. "He is a proud man who has fought against the white settlers for many years, believing that our people can still turn back the tide that threatens to wash away our way of life." Tom looked up from tending his wounded arm. "Warcloud? I've heard that name. He's supposed to be one of the most feared war leaders left on the southern plains." Aiyana nodded sadly. "Yes, he has earned that reputation through many battles, but he is also my father, and once he loved me more than his own life, until I brought shame upon our family." Chester, who had joined them in the freight car after turning the driving duties over to his assistant engineer, leaned forward with interest. "What kind of shame could a young woman like you bring upon a chief?" "The worst kind," Aiyana replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I fell in love with a white man." The statement hung in the air like smoke from the locomotive stack. Jake felt something twist in his stomach as he waited for her to continue, though he wasn't entirely sure why her words affected him so deeply. "His name was David Caldwell," Aiyana continued, her eyes distant with memory. "He was a cavalry officer stationed at Fort Richardson. We met when I was gathering herbs near the river, and he was different from the other soldiers. He treated me with kindness, with respect. He saw me as a person, not just as an enemy to be conquered." Seamus shifted uncomfortably. "Begging your pardon, miss, but how does a Comanche woman learn to speak English so well? And how did you come to spend time with a cavalry officer without your people knowing?" A ghost of a smile crossed Aiyana's face. "My father, despite his hatred of the white man's ways, is not a fool. He knew that understanding your language and customs might someday prove valuable. So he arranged for me to be taught by a Mexican trader who spoke both English and Spanish, in addition to our own tongue." She paused, wrapping her arms around her knees as the train swayed gently on the tracks. "As for David, we met in secret for many months. He would leave letters for me in a hollow tree by the river, and I would respond in kind. Slowly, we fell in love, though we both knew such a thing could never be accepted by either of our peoples." Jake found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite himself. "What happened? Did someone discover your meetings?" "Worse," Aiyana said, her voice growing heavy with grief. "David came to believe that he could make peace between our peoples. He requested a meeting with my father, saying he wanted to ask for my hand in marriage and to discuss terms for ending the hostilities between the cavalry and our band." Tom whistled low. "That took some courage, I'll give him that. What did your father say?" "He agreed to meet with David, but only as a trap." Aiyana's voice became strained, as if the words were being pulled from her against her will. "He told David that he would consider the proposal if the young officer would come alone to our camp, unarmed, as a gesture of good faith." Chester shook his head grimly. "And the boy was fool enough to do it?" "David believed in the power of love to overcome hatred," Aiyana replied. He was young and idealistic, and he thought that my father would see reason if only they could speak man to man. Jake could already guess how this story would end, but he remained silent, letting Aiyana tell it in her own way. My father received David with all the ceremony due to an honored guest, she continued. They smoked the pipe together and shared food. David spoke of his love for me and his desire for peace between our peoples. He was eloquent and sincere, and for a moment I dared to hope that perhaps a miracle might occur. The train whistle blew in the distance, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the sadness in Aiyana's voice. But when David finished speaking, my father stood up and said that while he respected the young officer's courage, he could never allow his daughter to marry an enemy of his people. Then he gave a signal, and 6 warriors stepped forward with their weapons drawn. Jake felt his jaw tighten with anger and disgust. They murdered him under a flag of truce? Not murdered, Aiyana said quietly. Executed. My father said that David had committed the crime of trying to steal a Comanche woman, and the penalty for such a crime was death. They tied him to a stake and... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The freight car fell silent except for the steady rhythm of the rails. Each of the men was lost in his own thoughts, trying to imagine the horror of what this young woman had witnessed. I tried to stop them, Aiyana continued after a long moment. I threw myself at my father's feet and begged for David's life. I offered to give up any claim to him, to submit to whatever punishment they deemed fit for me, if only they would spare him. But my father said that the decision had already been made, and that my pleas only proved how thoroughly the white man's poison had corrupted my mind. Tom looked up from his bandaged arm. So they killed him anyway? Aiyana nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. They made me watch. My father said it was necessary for me to see the consequences of betraying my people. David died bravely. He never cried out, never begged for mercy. Even at the end, he looked at me with love in his eyes. Jake reached out instinctively to comfort her, then pulled his hand back, not sure if the gesture would be welcome. I'm sorry, he said simply. No one should have to endure that. The story does not end there, Aiyana said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. After David's death, I became like a ghost in my father's lodge. I would not eat, would not speak, would not participate in the life of the band. The other women began to whisper that I had been cursed by the spirits of the dead white soldier. Chester leaned back against the side of the freight car. But something changed, didn't it? Otherwise you wouldn't have been scheduled for that particular punishment. Aiyana's expression hardened. 3 weeks ago, my father announced that he had arranged a marriage for me with Red Hawk, a war leader from a neighboring band. The marriage would strengthen the alliance between our peoples and help me forget my unnatural attachment to the white man's world. But you refused? Seamus guessed. I did more than refuse, Aiyana replied, her voice gaining strength. I stood up in front of the entire band and denounced my father's decision. I told them all that I would rather die than marry Red Hawk or any other man chosen for me. I said that David Caldwell had shown me what true love could be, and I would not settle for anything less. Jake could imagine the scene, young woman standing alone against the traditions and expectations of her entire tribe. The courage it must have taken was almost beyond comprehension. My father was furious, Aiyana continued. He said that I had publicly dishonored him and brought shame upon our family name. The Council of Elders met to decide my punishment, and they decreed that I should die in the same manner as the white soldiers who died when our warriors derailed their trains, crushed beneath the wheels of the iron horse. The irony was not lost on any of them. The very machine that had just saved Aiyana's life had been chosen as the instrument of her execution because of its association with the white man's encroachment into Comanche territory. So they brought you here to carry out the sentence, Tom said. Yes, and they would have succeeded if not for you 4 brave men. Aiyana looked at each of them in turn. You risked your lives for someone you had never met, someone whose own people wanted her dead. Why would you do such a thing? Jake found himself answering before he had consciously decided to speak. Because it was the right thing to do. Because no one deserves to die that way, regardless of what they might have done. And because, Chester added with a gentle smile, sometimes a person's past mistakes don't define who they really are inside. The train began to slow as they approached the outskirts of Abilene, and Jake realized that their journey together was almost over. But somehow, he found himself reluctant to let this brave young woman disappear from his life as suddenly as she had entered it. What will you do now? He asked. You can't go back to your people. and you're not exactly safe traveling alone in this territory." Aiyana looked out at the approaching town with eyes that held equal measures of hope and fear. "I do not know," she admitted. "I am caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Perhaps that is the price one pays for choosing love over duty." But Jake was already forming the beginnings of an idea, one that surprised him with its boldness and certainty. As the train whistle announced their arrival in Abilene, he found himself preparing to make a proposal that would change both their lives forever. The train shuddered to a stop at Abilene's modest depot, steam hissing from the locomotive as evening shadows began to stretch across the platform. Through the open door of the freight car, Jake could see the familiar bustle of a frontier town at the end of a working day, cowboys heading for the saloons, merchants closing their shops, and families gathering for their evening meals. "End of the line for now," Chester announced, though his usual cheerfulness was tempered by concern for what would happen to their rescued passenger. "Bill says we'll be here overnight for repairs and to take on water and coal." Aiyana gathered herself with dignity, preparing to leave the safety of the train for an uncertain future. She had no money, no friends in this white man's town, and no clear plan for survival. Jake watched her straighten her shoulders and lift her chin with the courage that had sustained her through so much tragedy, and felt his heart contract with something that might have been admiration or might have been something deeper. "Miss Aiyana," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I'd like to make you a proposition." She turned to look at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see so much. "What kind of proposition, Jake Morrison?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized how his words might be interpreted. "Not that kind," he said quickly. "I mean a business proposition. A way for you to make a new start without having to depend on charity." Tom and Seamus exchanged glances, clearly curious about what their friend had in mind. Chester climbed down from the freight car and turned to offer assistance to Aiyana, ever the gentleman despite his rough appearance. "I'm listening," Aiyana said simply. Jake took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to suggest would sound crazy to everyone present, including himself. "I've got a small ranch about 10 miles outside of town. Nothing fancy, just a cabin and enough land for some cattle and horses. I've been working it alone for the past 2 years, but it's more than one man can handle properly." He paused, trying to organize his thoughts. The idea had come to him suddenly, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. "The thing is, I know you can shoot, and you obviously know horses. You're smart and you're brave, and—" he struggled for words, "and I think you deserve a chance to build something good out of all this tragedy." Aiyana studied his face carefully. "You are offering me work as a ranch hand?" "More than that," Jake said, his conviction growing as he spoke. "I'm offering you a partnership. We work the ranch together, share the profits equally, and you have a safe place to live while you figure out what you want to do with your life." Tom looked at his friend with amazement. "Jake, are you sure about this? No offense to Miss Aiyana, but having a Comanche woman on your ranch is going to cause talk." "Let them talk," Jake replied with more firmness than he felt. "I've never cared much what other people thought of my business decisions." Seamus scratched his head thoughtfully. "There's also the matter of those warriors who were chasing us. They're not going to just give up and go home. They'll be looking for her." Jake had considered this as well. They'll be looking for a Comanche woman traveling alone or with strangers. They won't expect to find her working a cattle ranch like any other settler. Chester smiled approvingly. "You know, that's not a bad idea. Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight." Aiyana had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. Now she stepped closer to Jake, her expression serious. "Why would you do this for me? You do not know me, and as your friends have pointed out, I will bring you nothing but trouble." Jake found himself looking into her eyes and seeing not just the pain and courage he had noticed before, but also intelligence, strength, and something else that made his pulse quicken in a way he didn't fully understand. "Because," he said slowly, "I think you're worth the trouble, and because I believe everyone deserves a second chance to build a good life, even a woman who betrayed her own people for love, especially a woman who had the courage to stand up for what she believed in, even when it cost her everything." The words hung in the air between them, and Jake realized that something significant had just passed between them, though he wasn't sure exactly what it was. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her weighing her limited options. Finally, she extended her hand to him in the manner of white men making a business agreement. "I accept your proposition, Jake Morrison. I will work hard and earn my share, and I will not bring shame upon your kindness." Jake took her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip and the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "Partners, then." Tom shook his head but smiled. "Well, I'll be damned. Jake Morrison, you never cease to amaze me." "There's just one more thing," Jake said, suddenly realizing a potential complication. "You'll need a name that won't attract attention. Aiyana is beautiful, but it's obviously Indian." She thought for a moment. "David used to call me Anna. He said it was similar to my real name but would allow me to move freely in the white world if I ever chose to do so." Jake felt a pang at the mention of her lost love, but he pushed it aside. "Anna it is then." "Anna." He paused, realizing she would need a surname as well. "Morrison," she said quietly. "Anna Morrison. If we are to be partners, it would make sense for people to assume we are related. Brother and sister perhaps, or cousins." Jake nodded, though something about the suggestion made him slightly uncomfortable. "Anna Morrison it is." Chester clapped his hands together. "Well, that's settled then. But right now we all need food and rest. Jake, why don't you take Anna, and get her some proper clothes and a hot meal? Tom, Seamus, and I will handle the railroad paperwork and meet you at the hotel later." As the group prepared to separate, Jake realized that his life had just taken a dramatic turn. 24 hours ago, he had been a lonely railroad worker, with a modest ranch and few prospects for the future. Now he was about to begin a partnership with a remarkable woman whose presence would change everything about his quiet existence. "Are you sure about this, Aiyana?" Anna asked him quietly as they walked toward the main street of Abilene. "You are taking a great risk for someone you barely know." Jake looked at her profile in the lamplight beginning to flicker on along the boardwalk. "I've been taking risks my whole life," he said, "but I've got a feeling that this might be the first one that actually pays off." As they made their way through the evening crowds, neither of them noticed the group of dusty riders who had just arrived at the opposite end of town, their horses lathered with sweat and their eyes burning with the intensity of men on a mission of vengeance. The general store was nearly empty as Jake and Anna made their way inside, the proprietor preparing to close for the evening. Jake had never shopped for women's clothing before, and he found himself slightly embarrassed as he tried to explain their needs to Mrs. Patterson, the store owner's wife. "The young lady needs a complete outfit," he said awkwardly. "Something practical for ranch work, but also respectable for town." Mrs. Patterson, a kindly woman in her 50s with graying hair and understanding eyes, took one look at Anna's torn and dirty clothing and seemed to grasp the situation immediately. "Of course, dear. Let's get you fixed up properly." She led Anna behind a curtain to help her select appropriate garments, while Jake waited uncomfortably near the front of the store. Through the window, he could see the evening activities of Abilene's main street, cowboys celebrating the end of another day, merchants heading home to their families, and the occasional wagon rumbling past loaded with goods bound for destinations unknown. It was while he was watching this familiar scene that Jake first noticed them. 3 Comanche warriors sitting their horses at the far end of the street, their eyes scanning the crowds with obvious purpose. Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized one of them as the scarred warrior he had seen in the camp earlier that day. "Anna," he called quietly, not wanting to alarm Mrs. Patterson. "We need to hurry." Anna emerged from behind the curtain wearing a simple blue dress with a white apron, her long black hair now pinned up in the style favored by respectable frontier women. The transformation was remarkable. She looked like any other settler woman, though her natural beauty was impossible to disguise completely. "What is wrong?" she asked, noting the tension in Jake's voice. "Your former friends have come calling," Jake replied grimly, nodding toward the window. 3 of them, just sitting at the end of the street like they're waiting for something. Anna moved to the window and peered out carefully. "That is Standing Bear, my father's war chief. He is a very dangerous man, and very persistent. If he is here, the others cannot be far behind." Mrs. Patterson, who had been totaling their purchases, looked up with concern. "Is there some kind of trouble?" "Nothing we can't handle," Jake replied, though he was far from certain of that. He paid for Anna's clothes quickly and gathered up the packages. "Is there a back way out of here?" "Through the storeroom," Mrs. Patterson said, pointing toward a door behind the counter. "But young man, if you're in some kind of danger, perhaps you should talk to Sheriff Morrison." Jake paused at the mention of the lawman's name. "Morrison? Any relation to the railroad Morrisons?" "His nephew, I believe. Fine young man, very fair in his dealings with all the different folks who pass through town." Anna touched Jake's arm lightly. "We should go." Standing Bear will not wait long before he begins searching house by house. They slipped through the storeroom and out into the alley behind the general store. The sun had set completely now, and the back streets of Abilene were shrouded in shadows that provided welcome concealment. Jake led the way toward the hotel where they were supposed to meet his companions, staying to the darkest paths and avoiding the main thoroughfares. "Jake," Aiyana said softly as they moved through the darkness, "there is something else you should know about my situation. Something that makes it even more dangerous for you to help me." "What now?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect that every conversation with this woman would bring new revelations. "The marriage my father arranged with Red Hawk was not just a political alliance. Red Hawk had promised my father 50 horses and a substantial amount of gold in exchange for me as his bride. When I refused the marriage, Red Hawk demanded that my father return his gifts." Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. "And? My father had already distributed the horses among his warriors and spent the gold on weapons and supplies. He could not return Red Hawk's bride price without losing face among his people. So by refusing the marriage, you not only dishonored your father but also put him in debt to another chief?" Aiyana nodded miserably. "Yes, and Red Hawk is not known for his patience or forgiveness. He has sworn that he will have me as his wife, one way or another, or my father's band will face his wrath." Jake rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. "Is there anything else I should know? Any other vengeful chiefs or angry warriors who might be looking for you?" Before Aiyana could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the main street. Jake pulled her deeper into the shadows between two buildings as 3 figures appeared at the mouth of the alley. Comanche warriors moving with the silent grace of hunting cats. The lead warrior said something in their native tongue, and the other 2 spread out to search the surrounding area. Jake recognized the scarred face of Standing Bear in the dim light from the street lamps, and felt his hand move instinctively toward his gun. Aiyana placed her hand on his wrist, restraining him. "Do not," she whispered. "If you kill one of them, the others will know we are here. We must hide and wait for them to pass." They pressed themselves against the wall of the building, hardly daring to breathe as the Comanche warriors searched the alley systematically. Jake could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears and was certain that the sound must be audible to their pursuers. The minutes stretched like hours as the warriors moved closer to their hiding place. One of the Comanche stopped directly in front of their concealed position and stood motionless, as if sensing something amiss. Jake could see the man's face clearly in the lamplight, a young warrior with fierce eyes and war paint still visible on his cheeks. For an agonizing moment, it seemed certain they would be discovered. Then, from somewhere down the street, came the sound of a woman laughing loudly, followed by the crash of a breaking bottle. The warrior's attention was immediately drawn toward the disturbance, and he moved away from their hiding spot to investigate. After what felt like an eternity, the 3 Comanche warriors regrouped and moved on to search another section of the town. Jake and Aiyana remained hidden for several more minutes, making sure their pursuers were truly gone before emerging from their concealment. "The hotel is too dangerous now," Jake said quietly. "They'll be watching every obvious place where strangers might stay. We need to find another way out of town." Aiyana looked at him with something that might have been regret or gratitude. "You can still change your mind, Jake Morrison. You can walk away from all of this and go back to your simple life working the railroad." Jake studied her face in the dim light filtering from the street. Despite everything she had told him, despite the danger she represented, he found himself more determined than ever to see this through. "I've never been much good at walking away from things," he said simply. "Besides, we're partners now, remember? Partners stick together through good times and bad." The sound of horses moving quickly through the street made them both freeze. Through the gap between buildings, they could see more Comanche warriors arriving. 2 Comanche, at least 6 mounted braves joining the search for the missing woman. "They have brought many men," Aiyana observed grimly. "More than I expected, which means your friend Red Hawk must want you back pretty badly," Jake replied. "The question is, how do we get out of town without running into any of them?" Aiyana was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There is a way," she said finally, "but it will require us to take a great risk, and you will have to trust me completely." Jake looked at her determined expression and felt something stir in his chest that might have been fear or might have been admiration. "I'm listening." We walk out through the front of town, in plain sight, as if we have nothing to hide. Jake stared at her in amazement. "That's your plan? Walk right past a dozen Comanche warriors who are hunting for you? Sometimes the most obvious path is the safest," Aiyana replied. "They are looking for a fugitive hiding in the shadows. They will not expect to see me strolling down the main street like any other townsperson." It was, Jake had to admit, either the most brilliant plan he had ever heard, or the most insane. Given their limited options, he supposed it might not matter which. Jake and Anna emerged from the alley onto Abilene's main street, with the casual air of a couple taking an evening stroll. Anna had pulled her shawl up to partially conceal her face, and in the dim light of the street lamps, she looked like any other respectable frontier woman, out for a walk with her husband. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to maintain a relaxed posture as they moved through the evening crowds. They had walked perhaps 50 yards when Jake spotted two Comanche warriors standing in front of the saloon, their eyes scanning every face in the crowd. One of them was the young brave who had nearly discovered them in the alley, and Jake felt sweat break out on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Steady," Anna murmured, slipping her arm through his in a gesture that looked affectionate but was really meant to keep him from reaching for his gun. "Remember, we are just a married couple, heading home after an evening in town." As they approached the warriors, Jake forced himself to look straight ahead, neither avoiding their gaze nor staring directly at them. In his peripheral vision, he could see the Comanche studying every woman who passed, comparing faces to the mental image they carried of their quarry. They were no more than 10 feet from the warriors when one of them stepped forward, blocking their path. Jake felt his muscles tense, ready to draw his weapon and sell their lives dearly if necessary. The warrior said something in Comanche, his voice sharp with authority. Anna responded without hesitation in the same language, her tone respectful but not fearful. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the confidence in her voice as she gestured toward him and then toward the direction they had been walking. The exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours to Jake. Finally, the warrior stepped aside with what might have been an apology, and they continued on their way. Jake forced himself to maintain the same casual pace, though every instinct screamed at him to run. When they were well clear of the warriors, Jake leaned close to Anna and whispered, "What did you tell him?" "I told him we were newlyweds heading home to our ranch, and that my husband was eager to get me alone," Anna replied with the faintest hint of a smile. "I may have implied that you were rather impatient, Tupi." In matters of romance, Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "And he believed you?" "Men are the same everywhere, Jake Morrison. The idea of a young husband eager for his wife's company is one that any warrior can understand." They continued walking toward the edge of town, passing several more groups of searchers without incident. Jake began to believe that Anna's bold strategy might actually work. But as they neared the outskirts of Abilene, he spotted a familiar figure standing in the shadows near the livery stable. Chester was waiting beside a saddled horse, obviously prepared for a quick departure. When he saw Jake and Anna approaching, relief flooded his weathered features. "Thank God," he said quietly. "Tom and Seamus are already at your ranch, making sure it's secure. I was beginning to think those Comanche had caught up with you." "They're still looking," Jake replied, glancing back toward the town. "But Anna convinced them we were just another married couple." Chester looked at Anna with new respect. "Quick thinking, miss. But we're not out of the woods yet. Word is that more warriors are coming from the north, and they're planning to search every ranch and farm in the area." Jake felt his heart sink. His ranch, which had seemed like a perfect refuge just hours earlier, was now obviously a trap. "How long do we have?" "Maybe until dawn if we're lucky," Chester replied. "But Jake, there's something else. I talked to Sheriff Morrison, and he says there's been trouble brewing between the Comanche and the cavalry for weeks now. Some hothead colonel at Fort Richardson is talking about launching a punitive expedition against Warcloud's band." Anna went pale at this news. "If the soldiers attack my father's people, many will die on both sides, and it will all be because of me." "No," Jake said firmly. "It will be because of men who think violence is the answer to everything. You're not responsible for other people's choices." Chester mounted his horse and gathered the reins. "Jake, I hate to say it, but maybe it's time to consider getting Miss Anna out of the territory entirely. There are coaches heading east every day, and once she's back in the settled parts of the country, she'll be safe." Jake looked at Anna, trying to read her expression in the darkness. The idea of her leaving so soon after entering his life filled him with an unexpected sense of loss. "Is that what you want?" he asked her. "To go east and start over somewhere else?" Anna was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. "I have been running from difficult choices all my life, Jake Morrison. First, I ran from my father's expectations, then from my grief over David's death, and now from the consequences of my defiance. Perhaps it is time to stop running and face whatever comes." Even if it means more bloodshed? Chester asked gently. Especially if it means preventing bloodshed, Anna replied. There must be another way, some path that does not lead to war between my people and yours. Jake felt something stir in his chest at her words. Admiration, certainly, but also something deeper and more personal. This woman who had lost everything was still trying to find a way to save others from suffering the same fate. All right then, he said, making a decision that surprised even himself. We don't run, but we also don't hide. We go to your father and try to end this before it gets any worse. Chester stared at him in amazement. Jake, that's suicide. Warcloud will kill you on sight. Maybe, Jake acknowledged. But maybe not. Anna said her father is a proud man but also a practical one. If we can offer him a way to resolve this situation without losing face, he might listen. Anna looked at him with eyes that held both hope and fear. You would do that? Risk your life to make peace between our peoples? I'd do it to keep you safe, Jake replied, then felt his face flush as he realized what he had revealed. I mean, I'd do it because it's the right thing to do. But Anna had heard the truth in his first words, and something passed between them in the darkness that was more intimate than any physical touch. For a moment, the danger surrounding them faded into insignificance compared to the sudden awareness of feelings neither of them had expected to develop. Chester cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotional undercurrents swirling around his companions. Well, if you're determined to get yourselves killed, I suppose I'd better help you do it properly. But we'll need a plan, and we'll need it fast. As if to emphasize his point, the distant sound of war cries echoed across the prairie, suggesting that more Comanche warriors were indeed approaching. The net was closing around them, and soon they would have to choose between flight and a confrontation that could determine not just their own fates, but the fate of everyone caught between two cultures struggling to coexist in an unforgiving land. Jake looked at Anna one more time, seeing in her face the same determination that had sustained her through so much tragedy. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Number. Part 10. The pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the eastern horizon when Jake, Anna, and Chester approached Warcloud's camp. They rode slowly, their hands visible and weapons holstered, following the ancient protocols that governed such dangerous encounters. Behind them, the town of Abilene was waking up to what might be its last peaceful morning for a long time. Jake had spent the remaining hours of darkness wrestling with doubts about their mission. The plan they had devised was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Anna would return to her father voluntarily, accompanied by Jake as a representative of the white settlers who wanted peace. Chester would remain at a safe distance, ready to carry word back to town if negotiations failed. As they crested a low hill overlooking the Comanche encampment, Jake could see that Warcloud had indeed gathered a formidable force. At least 40 warriors were visible, their horses grazing nearby and their weapons ready for battle. Smoke rose from numerous cook fires, and the air was filled with the sounds of a war party preparing for action. It is not too late to turn back, Anna said quietly, though her own resolve seemed unshaken. My father will not welcome your presence, and some of his warriors may try to kill you before he can speak. Jake checked his pistol one final time, more for reassurance than necessity. I've come this far. I'm not turning back now. They were spotted while still several hundred yards from the camp, and within moments a dozen mounted warriors rode out to intercept them. Jake recognized Standing Bear among the riders, his scarred face grim with anticipation. The war chief's eyes blazed with fury when he saw Anna, but his expression became even more dangerous when he noticed Jake. Standing Bear barked out a command in Comanche, and the warriors surrounded the three riders with weapons drawn. Anna responded in her native tongue, her voice calm but authoritative. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear her invoking what sounded like formal protocols. After a tense exchange, Standing Bear gestured for them to follow, but not before ordering 2 warriors to disarm Jake. They took his pistol and rifle but allowed him to keep his dignity, which Jake took as a hopeful sign. The ride into the Comanche camp was like descending into a hostile world where death lurked behind every painted face. Warriors lined their path, many of them fingering their weapons and muttering what were undoubtedly threats. Jake kept his eyes straight ahead and his hands visible, following Anna's example of quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming danger. Warcloud was waiting for them in front of his lodge, a magnificent teepee decorated with symbols that spoke of many battles and great deeds. The chief was a man in his 50s, tall and powerfully built, despite his age, with eyes that seemed to see directly into a man's soul. He wore no war paint, but his very presence radiated authority and barely controlled rage. Aiyana dismounted and approached her father with the respectful bearing due to a chief, but Jake could see the pain in both their faces. This was not just a political confrontation, but a personal tragedy between a father and daughter who had once loved each other deeply. Warcloud spoke first, his voice carrying across the camp with the power of long command. Though Jake couldn't understand the words, the tone was clearly one of accusation and disappointment. Aiyana responded with what sounded like explanations and pleas, her own voice growing more passionate as she spoke. The exchange continued for several minutes, with other members of the band gathering to listen. Jake could see women weeping openly, suggesting that Aiyana had been well loved among her people before her transgression. Several older men nodded gravely at certain points in the conversation, while younger warriors muttered angrily and fingered their weapons. Finally, Warcloud turned his attention to Jake, and the intensity of his gaze was like looking into a furnace. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "You are the white man who stole my daughter from her punishment." Jake met the chief's eyes steadily. "I am the man who prevented a great injustice, Chief Warcloud, and I've come here to offer you a way to resolve this conflict with honor for all parties." A murmur ran through the gathered warriors at Jake's bold words. Several hands moved toward weapons, but Warcloud silenced them with a gesture. "You speak of honor, white man, but you know nothing of our ways. My daughter has brought shame upon our family and endangered our people through her defiance." "With respect, Chief," Jake replied, feeling sweat trickle down his back despite the cool morning air. "I know something about shame and honor. I also know that killing your own daughter won't solve the problems she's created." Warcloud's eyes flashed dangerously. "And what would you know of our problems?" Jake took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either open a door to peace or seal his death warrant. "I know that Red Hawk demands either his bride or the return of his gifts. I know that the cavalry at Fort Richardson is preparing to attack your people. And I know that all of this can be prevented if we can find another solution." The chief's expression showed surprise that this white stranger knew so much about their internal affairs. He glanced at Aiyana, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "You have been talking with my daughter. She told me about her situation, yes. But more importantly, she told me about her love for her people and her desire to prevent bloodshed." Warcloud was silent for a long moment, studying Jake's face as if trying to read his true intentions. "What solution do you propose, white man?" Jake felt his heart racing, but his voice remained steady. "My name is Jake Morrison, and I work for the railroad. I also own a small ranch with good water and grazing land. I propose to pay Red Hawk's bride price myself, in exchange for your daughter's freedom to choose her own path." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Warriors shouted angrily, some reaching for weapons despite their chief's presence. Even Standing Bear looked shocked by the audacity of the proposal. But Warcloud raised his hand, and gradually the tumult subsided. "You would pay 50 horses and gold for a woman who is not even of your people?" "I would pay it for peace," Jake replied. "And because Aiyana? Because your daughter deserves the chance to live free from the mistakes of the past." Aiyana stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion as she spoke to her father in Comanche. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the love and desperation in her tone. She was pleading not just for herself, but for all the lives that would be lost if this conflict escalated into war. Warcloud listened to his daughter's words, his stern expression gradually softening. When she finished speaking, he turned back to Jake with something that might have been respect beginning to show in his eyes. "You would do this thing for a woman you barely know?" Jake felt Aiyana's eyes upon him, and suddenly the truth he had been avoiding became crystal clear. "No, Chief Warcloud. I would do it for a woman I've come to love, even though I've only known her for a day. I would do it because she represents something beautiful in a world that has too much ugliness. And I would do it because sometimes a man has to take a stand for what he believes in, regardless of the cost." The words hung in the morning air like a prayer. Aiyana's intake of breath was audible, and Jake could see tears beginning to form in her dark eyes. Even some of the warriors looked moved by his declaration, though others still glowered with suspicion and hostility. Warcloud studied Jake for what felt like an eternity. "You speak with courage, Jake Morrison of the railroad. But courage alone does not make a man worthy of a chief's daughter." "No, sir, it doesn't," Jake agreed. "But maybe love, respect, and a willingness to sacrifice for her happiness might." The chief turned to Aiyana and spoke to her in Comanche, his tone now gentle rather than harsh. She responded with obvious emotion, and Jake could see the years of pain and separation beginning to heal between father and daughter. "My daughter says you are a good man, Warcloud said finally. She says you risked your life to save her without knowing anything about her, and that you have offered her partnership rather than servitude. Is this true? Island. Warcloud walked a few steps away, clearly wrestling with a decision that would affect not just his family but his entire people. When he turned back, his expression had changed completely. I will accept your offer, Jake Morrison, but not as payment for my daughter, for she is not property to be bought and sold. I will accept it as a gift from a man who loves her, to a father who wishes to see her happy, and in return, I will give you something more precious than horses or gold. What's that, Chief? My blessing on your marriage to Aiyana, if she will have you, and a promise that no Comanche warrior will ever again threaten either of you, as long as you treat her with the love and respect she deserves. Jake felt his knees go weak with relief and overwhelming emotion. He looked at Anna, seeing in her face a mixture of joy, love, and lingering uncertainty. Anna, he said softly, I know this isn't how most people fall in love, and I know we've only known each other for a short time. But if you'll have me, I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing to trust me. Anna stepped forward and took his hands in hers, her tears now flowing freely. Jake Morrison, you have given me back my freedom, my father's love, and hope for the future. Yes, I will marry you, and I will spend my life showing you that your faith in me was not misplaced. As they embraced in front of the entire Comanche band, a cheer went up from the assembled warriors. Even Standing Bear was smiling, and Warcloud looked upon the scene with the satisfaction of a man who had found an honorable solution to an impossible problem. Chester, who had been watching from a safe distance, rode down into the camp with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Well, I'll be damned, he said, dismounting to embrace his friend. Jake Morrison, you've just pulled off the most expensive and romantic proposal in the history of the American West. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, plans were quickly made. Red Hawk would be paid his bride price with horses from Warcloud's herd and gold that Jake would borrow against his ranch. The cavalry would be told that the Comanche conflict had been resolved peacefully, preventing the war that had seemed inevitable just hours earlier. But most importantly, two people who had found each other against all odds would be married according to both Comanche and white traditions, creating a bond that would bridge two worlds and prove that love could indeed triumph over hatred and prejudice. As Jake and Anna stood together, surrounded by her people who had welcomed him as a son, he realized that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a plan, but with a single act of compassion for a stranger in need. The Iron Horse had brought them together, but it would be their love that carried them forward into whatever challenges the future might hold. The morning sun cast golden light across the prairie, and in that light, anything seemed possible.